Hi, this week I'm just going to touch base and talk to you a little bit about assessing listening. So this will be just a short little mini lecture on this topic. Now, most of what we'll be talking about here is the different types of listening performance. And this comes primarily from a book called Language Assessment Principles and Classroom Practices by Douglas Brown. The version I have is 2004, but I find this book very helpful, very explicit in talking about the different aspects of speaking assessment, listening assessment, and so on. So if you are interested, you can look at this book further. One of the things that Brown talks about is he talks about that there are different reasons for listening, and he looks at listening performance in basically different types. So the first type is intensive. So this is when students are asked to listen for language components. Now there are different kind of language components, and usually this is based on the sound or the word or even a phrase. But these can look like phonological, so things like phonics or sounds, where maybe the teacher reads out a word, for example, ship, and the student has to decide and circle whether it's ship or sheep by listening to the sounds and then recognizing it in the written form. So that's where students are listening for particular sounds and identifying the sounds. Then there's morphological, which is looking at the structure. So maybe there's a sentence read out and she missed her bus the other day, and the student has to decide, is it miss or is it missed? So this is where they're listening for words, but they're also looking for the structure. Are they listening to the end of the word to identify whether it's a past, present tense? Then we have something called paraphrase recognition. So again, this is intensive listening. This is where you're listening for particular language components. So paraphrase recognition would be something, so Brown gives an example where the test takers, for example, hear, "Hello, my name is Kayeko, I come from Japan." Then they read and they have the option to choose A, Kayeko is comfortable in Japan, B, Kayeko wants to come to Japan, C, Kayeko is Japanese, and D, Kayeko likes Japan. So obviously the answer is C, Kayeko is Japanese, but they have to decide from that sentence what it means. And so they're looking at the different types of words for meaning and so on. Another type of listening performance is what we call responsive. So this is a short stretch of language, but more than just the word or a phrase, but for a short stretch of language and making a similar reply. So you have looking at the appropriate response, and again this can be in a multiple choice format. So if the question is how old are you, there can be different responses. So A, I'm 21 years old, which would be the correct one. But maybe another option would be about 3 years older, which isn't an appropriate response. So then you provide some other inappropriate responses. And this kind of gauges, do they actually understand that short sentence or stretch of language? And can they identify an appropriate response? You also have things like open-ended responses. So just simply, what is your favorite color? And then they respond correctly. So this is kind of responsive. So being able to make an appropriate response to a short stretch of language. The third type of listening performance is selective. So listening to a longer stretch of text, or this can be written, or someone's reading this out, or it could be recording, and identifying specific information. And this can be done in a few ways. So, we've mentioned something like a close activity. So it could be a listening close where there are some words that are taken out, and the students have to listen to the recording or to the teacher read out a text, and they have to identify. So they're identifying specific information and identifying those words and putting it into those gaps. Now, when creating a listening close, it's really important to make sure that the information is important information. You probably wouldn't be taking out information in not content words, unless your looking at specifically grammatical sorts of things. So if you're looking at if students can hear the difference between the a and the, you know, a man, the man, then maybe you can use that. But usually for listening, it's more about content words. Information transfer. So this is where students may listen to a text, a longer stretch of text, and then there are some pictures that kind of sums up what was discussed in the listening text, and they choose the appropriate picture. So that's kind of those who are more beginning. Then there's things like chart filling. So you have something where maybe you hear about, I tell you about what I'm doing today, and then you have a timetable and you write out, you know, what am I doing at this time? Because I've discussed my schedule, and then you actually have to fill out the chart identifying when I'm doing what and at what time. The other option for selective is sentence repetition. And the idea of sentence repetition is simply that there is a sentence that is said aloud, and then the student has to repeat it, the same sentence. The fourth type of listening performance is extensive, and this is where it's a bit of a longer text. And the idea is that they're looking and they're identifying more kind of main ideas or global understanding. One way to do this is a dictation. So this is where you have a text that is 50 to 100 words, and the students listen to it 3 times and they have to write down what is being said. So the first time is usually a normal speed, and the students kind of write down their main things, and then the second time it's slower and they try to fill it out, and then the third time is more checking to make sure they've written it correctly. Another extensive activity that can be used is what is called a stimulus response. So, and this is probably what we're most used to in regards to a listening test or assessment, and that's where maybe there's a conversation, and then the student answers multiple choice questions about what the conversation was about. And this kind of looks at, can they understand the general understanding of what the conversation was about? Some other kind of ways that performance is assessed is also kind of more interactive, and this is where listening is combined with speaking. And this can be done in a few different ways. So for example, maybe in a speaking assessment, it incorporates a listening comprehension criteria, but the main focus is the speaking assessment. And then you have the TOEFL IBT, which is an example of integrated tasks where students are, you know, listening to a talk and then they're writing notes. So they're actually integrating other, whether it's writing or speaking and so on, but it's very integrated. You can also use more authentic tasks, things like note-taking. So, you know, students listen to something and then they take notes, and they're given more kind of global scores. So maybe, you can look at accuracy of ideas, main ideas, and then you can attribute, you know, either a 0 points for nothing, 3 points, or 5. So you can, you know, and this is not an exact sort of thing with note-taking because it's a bit hard, because note-taking doesn't have to be word per word like a dictation, but it's more of have they actually taken down the ideas that are important. So that's a more authentic task. Then there's also editing work. So for example, let's say you have, the student has something that's written down, and then they listen for discrepancies. So maybe in the information that they've received, it says that the person's name is John, but when they're listening to it, actually his name is Jim. And so then they have to identify from what they can read and what they are listening to, what the discrepancies are, what's incorrect. So that's another way to look at it. That is all. This is just, again, a really quick way to look at some kind of ways that listening is assessed, and why we assess. So we can look at, you know, I think the main point is thinking that we can listen for very specific things like sounds to, you know, can students respond appropriately to more longer text and be able to look at more global and main ideas. So it's understanding what we're assessing and then assessing that, because a lot of times we can't assess everything. So it's identifying what exactly we are assessing in regards to listening. So that is all. There's one other video available for another class that I've made about creating multiple choice questions, because with listening, often multiple choice questions are used. So hopefully that can be helpful for you. Have a lovely week. Bye.